My dad never came to my hospital bedside as a child. I didn't come to his when he called. The text message came at 11:34 p.m. on a Friday in November. I was lying in bed next to my wife, reading a novel on my tablet, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. The message was from my stepmother, Kathleen, a woman I'd spoken to maybe 3 times in the past decade. Your father had a massive heart attack. He's in ICU at Mercy General. He's asking for you. Please come. Below the text was a photo, clearly taken without hospital permission, showing my father in a hospital bed, tubes running from his arms, an oxygen mask over his face, looking smaller and older than I remembered. The image was meant to shock me into action, to trigger some dormant filial instinct that would send me rushing to his bedside. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. No panic, no surge of concern. Just a hollow recognition that the man who'd taught me through decades of absence that I didn't matter to him now wanted me to pretend he mattered to me. I set the phone down, turned off my tablet, and went to sleep. My wife, Rebecca, asked if everything was okay. I said it was just spam and kissed her goodnight. The lie came easily because the truth was too complicated to explain at midnight. I'd been my father's son for 35 years, but I'd stopped expecting him to act like a father when I was 7 years old. That was the year I had my first major medical crisis, the one that taught me where I ranked in his priorities. It started with what seemed like a bad cold in late March, just ordinary sniffles and coughing that Mom initially treated with over-the-counter medication and rest. But after a week, I wasn't getting better. I was getting worse. The cough deepened, became painful and productive. I started running fevers that spiked at night, waking up drenched in sweat. Mom took me to our pediatrician, Dr. Alan Kensington, who'd been our family doctor since I was born. He listened to my chest, frowned, and ordered a chest x-ray. The x-ray showed pneumonia in both lungs, severe enough that Dr. Kensington said I needed to be admitted to the hospital immediately for IV antibiotics and monitoring. I remember Mom's face going pale, her hand tightening on mine as the doctor explained the severity. I remember asking if Dad would come with us to the hospital. Mom had hesitated, then said she'd call him. Dad worked in finance, some high-pressure job managing investment portfolios for wealthy clients that required long hours and frequent travel. He'd left for a business trip to Chicago that Monday, wasn't due back until Friday. Mom called him from Dr. Kensington's office, stepping into the hallway while I sat in the exam room trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. When she came back, her expression was carefully neutral, the look she'd perfected for hiding disappointment from me. She said Dad was in important meetings, but would try to get home as soon as possible. We went to the hospital, just the 2 of us. I was admitted to the pediatric ward, hooked up to an IV, given oxygen through a nasal cannula that made my nose itch. The first night was terrifying. I'd never been hospitalized before, never been away from home overnight except for sleepovers at friends' houses. This was different. Medical equipment beeping, nurses coming in every few hours to check vitals, the strange sounds of other sick children crying in nearby rooms. Mom stayed with me, sleeping in the uncomfortable recliner next to my bed, holding my hand when I woke up scared and confused. Dad didn't come that first night, or the second. Mom made excuses, saying his meetings had run long, that there'd been flight delays, that he'd be there soon. By the 3rd day, when I was finally starting to improve, responding to the antibiotics, breathing a little easier, Dad showed up. He walked into my hospital room at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, wearing his business suit, carrying his briefcase, looking stressed and distracted. He stayed for 45 minutes. During that time, he asked how I was feeling, told me I looked better than he'd expected, checked his watch 3 times, and took 2 phone calls from clients that he stepped into the hallway to answer. When he came back from the second call, he said he had to get to the office for an important meeting, but would try to come back later. He didn't come back. I was discharged the next morning, spent the weekend recovering at home with Mom, and Dad left for another business trip on Monday. That pattern, that specific template of absence during crisis, followed by brief, distracted presence, followed by more absence, would define my relationship with him for the next 28 years. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The second major incident happened when I was 9. I'd been riding my bike in our neighborhood, taking a corner too fast, and went flying over the handlebars. I landed hard on my left arm, felt something crack, and started screaming. Our neighbor, Mrs. Delilah Pierce, heard me and came running. She found me on the sidewalk, my arm bent at an angle that was obviously wrong, bone visible through the skin, compound fracture. She called an ambulance while keeping me calm, then called Mom at her work. Mom met us at the emergency room. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Jeffrey Strand, said I needed immediate surgery to set the bone properly and repair the tissue damage. I was prepped for surgery within 2 hours of the accident. Mom called Dad from the hospital, explained the situation, asked him to come. He was in New York for a conference. He said he'd try to catch an earlier flight but couldn't promise anything. The conference had critical networking sessions he couldn't miss. I went into surgery at 6:30 p.m. with only Mom there, crying in the waiting room, terrified because her 9-year-old was going under general anesthesia for the first time. The surgery went well. I I woke up in recovery with my arm in a cast from shoulder to wrist, groggy and nauseous from the anesthesia, asking for Dad. The nurse, a kind woman named Louise Fletcher, who'd been doing pediatric care for 15 years, told me my mom was waiting outside and would be in soon. I asked again about Dad. Louise looked at Mom, who was standing in the doorway with red-rimmed eyes, and Mom said Dad's flight had been delayed. He'd be home tomorrow. Tomorrow came and Dad called instead of coming to the hospital. He said his flight had been pushed back again due to weather. He'd be home Sunday. Sunday arrived and he came to the house, looked at my cast, signed it with a Sharpie, and took a photo. He was back on the road by Wednesday for another trip. The pattern was so consistent, it stopped surprising me. Medical crisis happened. Mom handled it. Dad showed up late or not at all, made excuses, left again. I learned not to expect him during emergencies. More importantly, I learned that his work, his clients, his professional obligations always took priority over my actual physical well-being. The third incident was when I was 12, a ruptured appendix that nearly killed me. I'd been complaining about stomach pain for 2 days, but Mom thought it was just a stomach bug. By the third day, the pain was excruciating, localized to my lower right abdomen, and I'd developed a high fever. Mom rushed me to the emergency room where Dr. Felicia Barnwell, the attending physician, immediately suspected appendicitis. The CT scan confirmed it, but worse, showed signs of perforation. My appendix had ruptured, spilling infection into my abdominal cavity. I needed emergency surgery immediately, or I could develop sepsis. Mom signed the consent forms with shaking hands, tried calling Dad, got his voicemail. She left a message saying I was going into emergency surgery, that it was serious, that he needed to come now. I remember being wheeled into the operating room, scared and crying, asking the anesthesiologist if I was going to die. He said no, that they were going to take good care of me. The surgery lasted 3 hours. They removed the ruptured appendix, cleaned out the infection, placed a drain to prevent abscess formation. I spent 5 days in the hospital recovering, fighting off the infection with heavy-duty antibiotics, dealing with the pain and fear of being 12 and facing my own mortality. Dad showed up on day 4. He'd been in San Francisco closing a major deal, couldn't get away until the deal was finalized. When he finally arrived, I was sitting up in bed, watching television, looking much better than I had those first critical days. He seemed relieved that I was okay, like my improvement justified his absence. He stayed for an hour, maybe less, making small talk about the hospital food and the TV shows I'd been watching, avoiding any conversation about how scared I'd been or how serious the situation had been. Mom sat in the corner watching this interaction with an expression I couldn't read then, but understand now. Contempt. She'd spent 4 days terrified her son might die from sepsis, while his father prioritized a business deal. She'd watched me cry for my dad during the worst pain of my young life, while he was in hotel conference rooms, shaking hands with investors. Something broke between them during those 4 days, something fundamental that no amount of later apologies could repair. They divorced within the year. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the truth was simpler. Mom had finally accepted what I'd learned through my hospital stays. Dad didn't prioritize family. He prioritized career, money, professional advancement, everything except the people who should have mattered most. The divorce was relatively clean because Mom didn't fight for much. She got primary custody of me, the house, child support that was generous because Dad could afford it, and it assuaged whatever minimal guilt he felt. Dad got visitation rights he rarely exercised and the freedom to continue his career without the inconvenience of family obligations. He moved into a downtown condo, started dating within months, married his assistant Kathleen within 2 years. Kathleen was 15 years younger, had no children, and seemed perfectly content being married to a man who worked 80-hour weeks and traveled constantly. My relationship with Dad became even more distant after the divorce. The court-mandated visitation schedule said every other weekend, but in practice it was more like once a month, and even those visits felt obligatory and awkward. Dad would pick me up Friday evening, take me to his sterile condo where I had a guest room that never felt like mine, and we'd spend the weekend making stilted conversation about school and sports while he checked his BlackBerry constantly and took calls from clients. He'd drop me back at Mom's Sunday evening looking relieved to return to his real life. By the time I was 14, I'd started making excuses to skip visits. By 16, I'd stopped going entirely, and Dad hadn't pushed back. The relationship dwindled to birthday cards with checks inside and awkward phone calls on holidays where we'd exchange superficial updates before running out of things to say. I started seeing Dr. Nathan Holbrook, a therapist specializing in family trauma and parental neglect, when I was 23, during my first year of graduate school. I'd gone initially for help with anxiety and depression I'd attributed to academic stress. Within the first session, Dr. Holbrook identified that my issues weren't about graduate school at all. They were rooted in my relationship with my father and the deep wound of being repeatedly shown that I wasn't worth showing up for. He asked me during our second session to describe a time when my father had prioritized my needs over his work. I sat in his office, afternoon sun coming through the Venetian blinds, and couldn't think of a single example. Every significant event in my childhood, every crisis, every achievement, Dad had been absent or minimally present, always with an explanation about work that supposedly justified the absence. Dr. Holbrook called it emotional abandonment, compounded by physical neglect during medical trauma. He said children who experience parental absence during hospitalization often develop attachment issues and trust problems that persist into adulthood. Dr. Holbrook suggested I document my memories of Dad's absences, not to build evidence against him, but to validate my own reality. He said children of neglectful parents often minimize their experiences, telling themselves it wasn't that bad or that their parent was just busy. Documentation would help me see the pattern objectively. I started writing down every incident I could remember where Dad had failed to show up: the pneumonia hospitalization, the broken arm surgery, the ruptured appendix emergency. I also documented the smaller absences: the school plays he'd missed, the parent-teacher conferences Mom attended alone, the 8th grade science fair where I'd won first place and Dad had been in London, the high school graduation where he'd shown up but left immediately after the ceremony for a flight to Tokyo. Within a month, I had 53 documented incidents spanning 18 years. The pattern was undeniable and devastating. My father had chosen his career over his son consistently, repeatedly, without exception. Dr. Holbrook asked if I'd ever confronted Dad about this pattern. I said I'd tried once, during college. After missing too many classes due to a depressive episode, I'd finally connected to Dad's neglect. I'd written him an email laying out specific examples of his absence and explaining how it had affected me. His response had been brief and defensive. He'd said he'd worked hard to provide for me, that his career success had paid for my education and comfortable childhood, that I was being ungrateful by focusing on times he couldn't be there, instead of appreciating what he'd given me. He'd reframed his neglect as sacrifice, his absence as provision. The logic was infuriating. He'd worked to make money, yes, but he'd never worked to build a relationship. I'd have traded the comfortable childhood for a father who showed up. Dr. Holbrook said Dad's response was typical of emotionally unavailable parents when confronted with their failures. They defend themselves by pointing to material provision while ignoring emotional deprivation. They can't acknowledge the harm they've caused because it would shatter their self-image as a good parent. Dr. Holbrook introduced me to the concept of strategic disengagement, the idea of protecting myself by pulling back from a relationship that consistently hurt me. I'd stop expecting Dad to show up, stop sharing important information with him, stop participating in the fiction that we had a meaningful father-son relationship. I'd maintain minimal contact out of social obligation, the occasional holiday phone call or birthday acknowledgement, but I wouldn't invest emotionally. I wouldn't give him opportunities to disappoint me because I'd already accepted he wasn't capable of being the father I needed. The strategy worked. Over the next decade, my relationship with Dad became essentially non-existent. We'd exchange brief emails a few times a year. He'd send money for birthdays and Christmas. We'd see each other maybe once a year at family events, make awkward small talk, part ways without any real connection. He'd remarried Kathleen, seemed content in his workaholic lifestyle, never asked about my life in any meaningful way. I built my own life separate from him, got my PhD in psychology, started working as a clinical therapist, specializing in family trauma, married Rebecca, bought a house. Dad knew these facts in abstract, but wasn't involved in any of them. The real test of my strategic disengagement came when I was 28 and had a serious car accident. I'd been driving home from work on a rainy evening in October when a truck ran a red light and T-boned my car on the driver's side. The impact shattered my window, deployed the airbag, and left me trapped in the wreckage with a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding. The paramedics had to use the jaws of life to extract me from the vehicle. I was rushed to University Hospital where Dr. Simone Whitfield, the trauma surgeon on call, performed emergency surgery to repair a lacerated spleen and stabilize my pelvis. I was in the ICU for 3 days, critical condition, before being moved to a regular room for recovery. Mom was there within an hour of the accident, stayed with me through the surgery, slept in the ICU waiting room, was at my bedside when I woke up confused and in pain. Rebecca was there too, my girlfriend at the time, pale and shaking but present. My close friend David Quinn came straight from his job site still in his construction gear. Multiple people showed up because they actually cared about me. I never called Dad. Mom asked if she should contact him. I said no. She respected my decision without question. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, another month recovering at home before I could return to work. Dad never knew. It wasn't until 8 months later, when we happened to see each other at a family funeral, that he found out. My aunt mentioned something about the accident in conversation, and Dad looked at me shocked. He pulled me aside after the service and asked why I hadn't told him. I said I'd had people taking care of me and didn't need to bother him. He said he was my father. Of course he would have wanted to know. I said that was nice of him to say, but I'd learned through experience not to expect him during medical emergencies. He started to argue, but I cut him off. I said I had to go and walked away. That was the last substantive conversation we had before the text message 7 years later telling me he'd had a heart attack. When I woke up the next morning after ignoring Kathleen's text, I had 16 missed calls and 32 text messages. Kathleen had called repeatedly through the night. So had my half-sister Lily, Dad's daughter with Kathleen, a 22-year-old I'd met maybe 5 times. Various extended family members had also called, all with the same message. Dad was in critical condition. The heart attack had been massive, what the doctors called a widowmaker, a complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery. He'd survived the initial event only because he'd been at a restaurant when it happened, and someone had called 911 immediately. The paramedics had gotten him to the hospital within 15 minutes, where Dr. Raymond Foster, a cardiac surgeon with 20 years of experience, had performed an emergency angioplasty to open the blocked artery. Dad was alive, but the damage to his heart was severe. He'd been in the ICU since Thursday night, had stabilized overnight but remained critical. He'd been asking for me repeatedly, becoming agitated when told I hadn't arrived yet. Kathleen's most recent text, sent at 7:48 a.m., said the doctors wanted to keep him calm and seeing me might help. She was begging me to come. Rebecca woke up and asked what was wrong. I showed her the texts. She read through them, then looked at me with concern. She said my dad was in the ICU asking for me, and I was just sitting here. I said yes, that was accurate. She asked if I was planning to go. I said no. She asked why not. I explained the history, the pattern of absence during my own hospitalizations, the decades of deprioritization, the strategic disengagement I'd practiced for years. I told her about the car accident he'd never known about because I'd learned not to include him in my medical crises. I said I'd spent my entire life learning that I wasn't worth his presence during emergencies. I wasn't going to unlearn that lesson now just because he'd decided he needed me at his bedside. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Then she said she understood my reasoning but worried I'd regret this when he died. I said I'd made peace with that possibility. The guilt of refusing would be easier to live with than the resentment of showing up for someone who'd never shown up for me. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I spent that Saturday doing normal weekend activities. I went for a run, did some grocery shopping, worked on an article I was writing for a psychology journal about intergenerational trauma patterns. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts that I ignored. By evening, the messages had shifted from requests to anger. Kathleen sent a long text calling me heartless and cruel. She said Dad had always provided for me, paid for my education, given me every advantage, and this was how I repaid him. She said he'd made mistakes, but he was dying now, and I needed to get over my grudges and be there for him. Lily sent shorter messages, but equally hostile. She said she'd always heard I was the troubled, ungrateful son, and now she understood why Dad didn't talk about me much. Extended family members weighed in with their own judgments, all variations on the same theme. I was selfish, vindictive, destroying my relationship with my father over ancient history when he needed me most. The messages bothered me less than I'd expected. These people didn't know the full story. They saw my current absence, but not the decades of his absences that preceded it. They saw a dying man asking for his son, but not the 7-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed with pneumonia asking for his father. They saw my refusal as cruelty without understanding it as consequence. I talked it through with Dr. Holbrook in an emergency session I'd scheduled for Saturday evening. I told him everything, the heart attack, the messages, my decision to stay away, the guilt trip from family members. He asked how I felt about my choice. I said I felt clear and certain. He asked if I thought I'd regret it. I said probably not. He asked why I was so sure. I explained that showing up now would mean pretending we had a relationship we'd never had, participating in a deathbed reconciliation that would be false on both sides. Dad didn't actually want me there. He wanted the idea of his son at his bedside because that's what fathers are supposed to have. I didn't want to be there. I wanted nothing from him. Forcing a connection now wouldn't heal anything. It would just create a new resentment that I'd have to process later. Dr. Holbrook said that sounded like a clear-eyed assessment. He pointed out that family and society would judge me harshly for this choice regardless of my reasoning. Could I handle that social pressure? I said I thought so. I'd spent years learning to live with difficult truths about my family. I could handle judgment from people who didn't understand the context. He asked if there was anything Dad could say or do that would change my mind. I thought about it and said no. Even if he apologized, even if he acknowledged his failures, even if he begged for forgiveness, it wouldn't change the fundamental reality. We'd never had a real relationship. He'd been absent during every crisis of my childhood. I'd learned to live without him. His current crisis didn't create an obligation on my part to suddenly pretend we were close. Dr. Holbrook said that was a fair position, but asked me to consider one more angle. Was I refusing to visit as a way of protecting myself, or as a way of punishing Dad? The distinction mattered because one was healthy boundary setting, and the other was revenge that might haunt me later. The question hit harder than I'd expected. Was this punishment or protection? I sat with it for a while, really examined my motivations. I decided it was both, and I was okay with that. Yes, there was an element of payback, of showing Dad what it felt like to need someone and have them not show up. But that wasn't the primary motivation. Primary was self-protection, refusing to participate in a pattern that had hurt me for decades. I wouldn't reward his lifetime of absence with my presence at his deathbed. I wouldn't let him use me to feel better about himself as he died. I wouldn't give him the closure he'd never given me. Dr. Holbrook said that sounded honest. He warned me that the aftermath might be complicated, that choosing not to see a dying parent created ripple effects I couldn't fully predict. Family relationships might fracture permanently. I might face ongoing social judgment, but he said if I'd made the decision with full awareness of the consequences and could live with them, then it was the right decision for me. Sunday came, and the messages intensified. Kathleen called from the hospital at 9 a.m., and I made the mistake of answering. She didn't even wait for me to say hello before launching into an aggressive monologue about what a terrible son I was. She said Dad was in and out of consciousness, kept asking where I was, couldn't understand why I wouldn't come. The doctors said his heart was failing faster than expected, that he might not survive another 48 hours. She said I was killing him by staying away, that the stress of my absence was making his condition worse. She said if he died without seeing me, I'd have to live with that guilt forever. I listened to the entire speech without interrupting. Then I said I was sorry she and Dad were going through this, but my decision hadn't changed. I wouldn't be coming to the hospital. She started screaming, calling me names I won't repeat, saying things about my character that would have devastated me if they'd come from someone whose opinion I valued. I hung up and blocked her number. Mom called an hour later. I answered because I always answered Mom's calls. She said she'd heard about Dad's heart attack through family channels and wanted to check on me. She asked how I was handling it. I said I was fine, had decided not to visit, was dealing with a lot of angry messages from Dad's side of the family. Mom was quiet for a moment. Then she said she supported my decision completely. She said she'd been there through all those hospitalizations when I was young, had watched Dad choose work over his sick son repeatedly, had seen how much his absence had hurt me. She said if I didn't want to show up for him now, she understood completely. She said whatever I decided, she was proud of me for protecting myself and maintaining boundaries with someone who'd never respected me. The validation from Mom meant everything. She was the only person who'd witnessed the full pattern, who understood why I'd made this choice, who didn't try to guilt me into changing my mind. Monday morning, I went to work. I had clients scheduled, people dealing with their own family traumas and relationship issues who needed my professional support. I sat in my office at the counseling center where I worked, conducting therapy sessions, helping other people process their parental neglect and childhood wounds, while my own father lay dying in an ICU across town. The irony wasn't lost on me. One of my clients, a woman named Patricia Davenport, who I'd been seeing for 6 months, noticed I seemed distracted and asked if everything was okay. I said I was dealing with a family situation but didn't elaborate. She'd shared enough of her own story, her mother's emotional abuse and father's passive enabling, that I thought she might understand. I told her briefly about Dad's heart attack and my decision not to visit. She looked at me with something like awe and said she wished she had my strength to set boundaries with toxic parents. She said she'd spent her whole life trying to win her mother's approval, and it had only brought her misery. I said setting boundaries wasn't strength, it was survival. She said maybe that was the same thing. Dad died Monday night at 11:23 p.m. Kathleen called from a number I hadn't blocked to tell me, her voice flat with exhaustion and hatred. She said he'd died asking for me, that his last words had been wondering why his son hadn't come. She said I'd killed him as surely as if I'd stopped his heart myself. She said she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I was, that I'd refused to see my dying father. She hung up before I could respond. I sat in my living room, Rebecca next to me on the couch, and felt a wave of complicated emotions. Grief for the father I'd needed and never had. Relief that the situation was resolved and I wouldn't face continued pressure to visit. Guilt that was smaller than I'd expected but present nonetheless. Mostly, I felt a strange kind of peace. I'd made the choice that protected me, and I could live with the consequences. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday. I wasn't planning to attend. Kathleen made that decision easier by sending me an email Friday night saying I wasn't welcome at the service. She said I'd forfeited any right to mourn Dad by refusing to see him when he was dying. She said my presence would upset the family and dishonor his memory. She said if I showed up, she'd have security remove me. I showed the email to Rebecca, who read it with disgust. She said Kathleen was being cruel and I should go anyway, that I had every right to be there regardless of her hostility. I said I didn't want to go, that sitting through a funeral service full of people who'd judge me while listening to eulogies about what a great man Dad had been sounded like torture. I'd grieve in my own way, on my own terms. Rebecca said she understood and offered to do something with me that day to help me process. We ended up going hiking, spending the day in nature while Dad was being buried across town. The fallout from my refusal to visit lasted months. Extended family members sent angry emails and left hostile voicemails. I was uninvited from family gatherings, told I wasn't welcome at reunions or holiday celebrations. Relatives who'd been cordial before now treated me like I'd committed an unforgivable sin. My Aunt Dolores, Dad's sister, sent a particularly venomous letter saying I'd broken Dad's heart with my absence, that he died feeling unloved by his own son, that I was a disgrace to the family name. I read the letter once, felt nothing, and threw it away. These people had never been part of my life in any meaningful way. Their rejection didn't create a loss because there'd been no real connection to lose. My actual support system, Mom, Rebecca, my close friends, Dr. Holbrook, all supported my choice. That was enough. The unexpected complication came from the will. Dad's attorney, a man named Philip Thorndike, who specialized in estate planning, called me 6 weeks after the funeral. He said he needed to schedule a meeting to discuss Dad's estate. I said I wasn't interested in inheriting anything, and he could distribute everything to Kathleen and Lily. Philip said it was more complicated than that Dad's will had specific provisions regarding me that needed to be addressed legally. He said the meeting was mandatory. I agreed reluctantly, scheduling it for the following Wednesday at Philip's downtown office. I showed up at 2 p.m., was escorted to a conference room where Kathleen and Lily were already seated, both of them glaring at me with obvious hatred. Philip entered with a thick file folder and sat at the head of the table. He started by explaining that Dad's estate was substantial, approximately $4 million in assets including real estate, investments, and life insurance. The bulk of it went to Kathleen and Lily, but Dad had left me a specific bequest, $500,000, and a letter. Philip slid an envelope across the table, my name written in Dad's handwriting. Kathleen protested immediately, saying there must be a mistake, that I'd refused to see Dad when he was dying and didn't deserve a penny. Philip said the will had been written 3 years ago and was legally binding. My inheritance was mine regardless of Kathleen's objections. He said I could read the letter now or take it with me. I chose to read it later, in private. I took the envelope and left the office while Kathleen was still arguing with Philip about challenging the bequest. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before opening the letter. Dad's handwriting was familiar from the birthday cards he'd sent over the years, always brief generic messages signed, "Love, Dad," that had meant nothing. This letter was different. 3 pages, handwritten, dated 6 months before his death. It started with an acknowledgement that we'd never been close, that he'd failed me as a father in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He said Kathleen had encouraged him to see a therapist after a health scare the previous year, and through therapy, he'd started to recognize the patterns doctor Holbrook had tried to get him to see decades earlier. He'd been absent during my childhood crises, not because work was more important, but because he'd been afraid of hospitals, of sickness, of his own powerlessness in the face of his child's suffering. He'd used work as an escape from that fear, convincing himself that providing financially was the same as providing emotionally. The letter continued with specific apologies for specific incidents. He was sorry for missing my pneumonia hospitalization, sorry for not being there during my appendectomy, sorry for the broken arm surgery he'd skipped, sorry for every medical crisis and achievement and ordinary moment he'd missed because he'd been too cowardly to show up. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, that he'd created damage that couldn't be repaired with words. He said he was leaving me money not because it would fix anything, but because it was the only thing he knew how to give. He said he hoped I'd use it to build a life that made me happy, since he'd failed to be part of that life himself. The letter ended with a sentence that broke something in me. I don't expect you to be at my deathbed when the time comes. I've taught you too well that I'm not worth showing up for. But I hope you know that I always loved you, even though I never learned how to show it. I sat in that parking garage and cried for the first time since learning Dad had died. Not crying for the man he'd been, but for the father he could have been if he'd faced his fears instead of running from them. The letter changed nothing about my decision not to visit him. He'd acknowledged his failures too late for it to matter. But it gave me something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not the deathbed reconciliation he'd wanted, but something more valuable. The knowledge that he'd finally understood what he'd done, that his absence hadn't been malicious but cowardly, that he'd hurt himself as much as he'd hurt me by choosing work over relationship. It didn't excuse the damage, but it explained it in a way that made healing possible. I showed the letter to Dr. Holbrook in our next session. He read it carefully, then asked how I felt about it. I said relieved. Dad had finally taken responsibility for his choices, had acknowledged the harm without making excuses, had given me permission to not feel guilty about staying away. Dr. Holbrook said that was a significant gift, even if it came posthumously. He asked if the letter changed how I felt about refusing to visit. I said no. The letter confirmed I'd made the right choice. Going to his deathbed would have been performing a relationship that didn't exist. Staying away had been honest, and honesty was what I'd needed to maintain my own integrity. Dr. Holbrook said that sounded like I'd found peace with a difficult decision. I said I had. I'd chosen myself over my father the same way he'd chosen himself over me for 35 years. The symmetry felt like justice. I used the inheritance to pay off my house and Rebecca's student loans. I put the rest in a college fund for the children we were planning to have. The money felt like Dad's final attempt at provision, giving materially since he'd never given emotionally. I accepted it without guilt, because I'd earned it through decades of his neglect. Every dollar represented a missed hospital visit, a skipped parent-teacher conference, an absent birthday celebration. I'd paid for that money with my childhood, and I'd use it to build a better future than he'd given me. Kathleen never spoke to me again. Neither did Lily. Extended family members either cut me off or pretended nothing had happened, and I'd simply drifted away naturally. I was fine with all of it. I'd never needed their approval, and I didn't need their presence in my life. A year after Dad's death, Rebecca and I had our first child, a son we named Oliver. Holding him in the hospital, watching Rebecca recover from delivery, I thought about all those times Dad had missed being at my bedside. I thought about how terrified I'd been as a child, lying in hospital beds asking for my father who never came. I made a promise to Oliver in that moment that I'd show up for him always, that he'd never experienced the abandonment I'd lived through, that my presence would be the foundation of his security. Rebecca watched me hold our son and asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking about how to be a better father than mine. She said I already was, just by being there. 2 years after Dad's death, I got a message from Kathleen's number. I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another hostile accusation. But curiosity won out. The message was from Lily, using her mother's phone. She said she'd found some of Dad's journals from the years before he died, entries where he'd written about his regrets regarding our relationship. She said reading them had helped her understand why I'd stayed away, that Dad had documented his own failures as a father in ways that matched the letter he'd left me. She said she was sorry for the things she'd said after he died, that she'd been young and hadn't understood the full story. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her or have a relationship with her, but she wanted me to know she finally understood. I wrote back a brief message thanking her for reaching out and wishing her well. I didn't pursue a relationship with her. There was too much history, too much pain, but I appreciated her willingness to see past the family narrative and recognize the truth. 3 years after Dad's death, I stopped seeing Dr. Holbrook regularly. We'd worked together for over a decade, processing my childhood trauma and building healthier patterns for my adult life. In our final session, he asked how I felt about everything that had happened with Dad. I said I felt at peace. I'd made the right choice for me, protecting myself from continued pain while allowing him to face the consequences of his lifetime of choices. I didn't regret refusing to visit, didn't feel guilty about his death, didn't wish I'd done anything differently. I'd grieved the father I'd needed and never had, accepted the father he'd actually been, and moved forward with my own family. Dr. Holbrook said that sounded like genuine healing, not just coping or avoidance. He said I'd broken the cycle of abandonment by becoming present for my own son in ways my father never was for me. That was the ultimate victory over the past. People still ask sometimes if I regret not seeing my father before he died. Family members who've heard the story second or third hand, distant relatives at rare social gatherings, acquaintances who learn about my background through casual conversation. I tell them the truth. No, I don't regret it. My father taught me through decades of absence that I wasn't worth his presence during my crises. I applied that lesson when he had his crisis. The symmetry wasn't cruel, it was consequence. He'd wanted a deathbed reconciliation to ease his own guilt, to feel like he'd made amends before dying. I'd refused to give him that comfort because he'd never earned it. Instead, I'd given myself something more valuable, the right to protect my own well-being, to refuse toxic obligation, to choose myself the way he'd chosen himself for 35 years. That choice saved me in ways showing up never could have. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.